You said, I think I saw in an interview that you love ranters, but women, people who do rants, that is, but women aren't really, people don't want to see women ranting.
No. Well, I feel there are many things people don't want to see women doing.
Yes, let us make a list.
Yeah.
There are many.
Yeah. Many things.
Yeah.
Many things. Yeah.
Hello there. So nice to be back in, my home away from home. I'm here to interview Claire Messud, as you all know, so let me introduce her. She was born in Greenwich, Connecticut, the daughter of a Canadian mother and a French-Algerian father. She grew up in Australia, America, and here in Toronto, where she lived for 5 years. She's the author of 5 works of fiction, including the bestseller The Emperor's Children, which was longlisted for the Man Booker in 2006, and The Woman Upstairs, which was published in 2013. Her newest novel is The Burning Girl, which is the story of the friendship between schoolgirls Cassie and Julia. Cassie's light burns brighter, while Julia is the more sensible one, the provider of boundaries, and ultimately the one whose heart is broken when the friendship ends. Claire Messud currently lives in Massachusetts with her husband, the literary critic James Woods, and their 2 children. Please welcome Claire Messud. It was interesting, Greg was talking about a YA spectacular that they're going to have in a couple of weeks. And one of the things I read about the book was that it was a YA book, which I didn't read it like that at all. But you do tell the story from the point of view of a 17-year-old girl, as opposed to like an adult looking back, which is so often the case in these books. Why did you choose to go that route?
Well, there were a number of reasons, but I would say one of the things that I feel it's easily misconstrued, but one of the things I wanted to, there are lots of things I was trying to do, and we'll talk about some of them.
Just make a list.
But one of them, I thought of it in a way as trying to write a children's book for adults. And the by which I mean a book that you, as a reader, throw yourself into without question, in which the worldview is that when we read Greek myths, for example, we read that there was a maiden, Zeus fell in love with her, Hera got jealous, Hera turned the girl into a cow or whatever, and you don't when you're reading the Greek myths say, hey, wait a minute, that's not plausible. You can't turn a person into a cow. We say, okay, fine, and that's how all children read. And in fact, I think it's much more how we live our lives than we acknowledge. But I think I didn't accept that in my adulthood until probably the last 5 or 10 years in the course of I would say my parents' illnesses and deaths, in which the world suddenly became full of signs and wonders to me. And I felt that if I had a narrator who was 25 or 30, that narrator would not believe in a world of signs and wonders. And I wanted a narrator who did.
Who did, and this one does. It's about friendship between girls. What interested you about that topic?
What didn't?
What didn't, yes. Hello. Yeah.
I think the sort of immediate answer is that as a parent, our children are now teenagers. Our nieces and nephews also a little bit older, and so for the past number of years, I have relived the travails of adolescence and the passions of adolescence, but at a remove, and yet in palimpsest, because of course what it does to relive that is to bring back all your memories, your own memories, the terrible things that make you blush, 40 years later, but that are still alive. So I think I've been so acutely conscious of that, the intensity of those friendships and of that time and the tumult of it.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. They're so fraught, girls' relations, girls' friendships, much more than, say, boys. At least this is what it's. I think that's the conventional wisdom. Why do you think that is? That girls' friendship is more fraught?
Well, I think there are probably lots of reasons. One of the things that anecdote. This is anecdotal. I am clearly not a social
scientist. That's
clearly
right.
not a social scientist. But when our children were small, and we would take them at their different ages, but take them to kindergarten, in both of their classes in their different years, it would happen that in the free play time before before the teacher assembled them all in a circle. The boys would go in different corners and would make a train, build a train set or a Lego tower or take apart a radio or work on a puzzle. And the girls would go to the table in the middle of the room at which there was paper, paper and crayons. And the girls would sit around the table and they would draw and they would talk, right? So from the very beginning, the boys treated it like they were going to the office. And they'd sort of say, hey, 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 and then just sort of settle down to whatever little, lonely thing they wanted to do. And the girls were social.
Yeah.
And I do feel that's purely anecdotal, but one doesn't want to be essentialist, and it's obviously not true of all girls. But as generally in society, I feel that a lot of the talking
is done by the women?
Is done by the women. And so there's, right?
Yes, I think if we asked the husbands, they'd say, yes, that's very true.
But it means that what friendship means. I mean, I look at our son, and what friendship means to him is getting on his bike and going to the soccer field and kicking the ball. So he has a great time, but, his friend is usually like, as the other end of they're not talking. Yeah. They're doing. Yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And, I'm sure you've read Elena Ferrante's books, the Neapolitan novels, which, of course, so friendship seems like it's the thing that people are interested in, or maybe it's coincidental. There seem to be these books about the nature of friendship. People are really interested in it. And I think those books were the revelation that they were because of how difficult and really ugly, friendship could be. Yeah. What was your reaction to the Ferrante books? Did you like them?
Yes, very much. I mean, I think yes, I think that so much. Her project is so big, right? And
it's also about Naples, right?
Right, and it's about Italian, Italian society of the second half of the 20th century, and about so many things. But certainly that first volume is very much about girls' friendship, along with all those other things. And the world in which those girls live is so brutal, right? There's so much violence in that world, and they, from very early on, sort of do violence to one another. I mean, the book opens with they play with their dolls, and
and one throws
the other's doll into the basement where she, down through the grate into the basement where she can't get. It's mean.
It is mean, and then there's the mean girls thing. You think, how is that friendship? I mean, there is a bond there, obviously, but it is, and in a way, not anything like that happens in your book, but there is a kind of power imbalance as there are in all friendships. And Julia, who's the narrator, who's telling us the story, looking back just a little bit, says, I think the line was, we didn't fight outright. I couldn't risk it, which was to say she couldn't risk irritating Cassie because Cassie was obviously, the
more
power
powerful
girl, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's just the nature of these relationships. They're up, they're down.
Well, I think to some extent it is. I think certainly I feel I've been on both sides. Over the course of my life, I've been on both sides of that, holding the power and having the power held over me. Yeah. At different moments with different people, and there's no question that. One thing I would say is that part of the reason that's the dynamic. Julia is the narrator of the book. The narrator is never in the spotlight, right? If you're in the spotlight, you don't have time to narrate.
That's right.
So if you think there are so many Gatsby but also I often have in mind Brideshead Revisited.
Yes.
Right, where Charles Ryder and Sebastian Flight, I thought Ryder, Flight, Flight is off living and Ryder is observing and writing it down.
Is writing.
Yeah.
It's true. That's the way it's got to be. Is my mic okay? I feel like it's falling off, but you can hear me okay? So we can live with maybe the not so fashionable look, but as long as you can hear me, that's okay. One of the things that struck me about the book, of course, was the title, The Burning Girl. And as you know, there's so many books now with, Girl on a Train and Gone Girl, and this book does not go to that territory at all. No. But can you tell me about the title, why it's called The Burning Girl?
Sure. There are two things. The direct reason is the epigraph is from an Elizabeth Bishop poem called Casabianca, which is in itself a riff on a Victorian parlor poem, which some of you may know. The boy stood on the burning deck, whence all but he had fled. Da 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 dead.
Yeah.
Right, right. You know, but the Elizabeth Bishop poem, which is a sort of meta riff on that, is about a boy reciting the poem. And because for me, in this story, Julia tells the story of Cassie. Cassie is in some sense the burning girl, as it were, the initial poem.
Right, right.
But Julia is also the burning girl in telling the poem. And one of the lines in the Elizabeth Bishop poem is, "And loves the burning boy." And you know, Julia is telling her story out of love.
Yeah.
So the Elizabeth Bishop poem was really the source of the title. But the other thing I would say is that one of the other sort of main things that in writing this book I was trying to write about is the way in which this will seem like a digression, but it's not really so far. So I read a book about the way we see, a sort of book about the neurology of the way we see, that explained that our brains process only 30% of what our eyes take in. And the rest our brains fill in with what we already know, which is why, for example, a child sees a monster in the corner and a grown-up sees a pile of laundry, is because you as a grown-up have seen many times this thing and know it to be a pile of laundry.
Right.
But we do this with stories also, right? And we think, we you know, if I say to you, well, I heard her husband's having an affair, and you say, yes, with his secretary, I know that story, right? I mean, you know, I feel we think we know the stories already. And indeed, all of those girl stories, we think we know the stories. And the story of the girl's friendship unraveling, we think we know the story. You might look at the title and think, I know the story. But we don't know the story.
So you wanted to subvert that. You
Yes.
wanted to say, you don't know the story.
Yes.
And I'm going to tell you what it is. Were you at all worried about the title because of all the association with Girl on the Train? I mean, we'd like to have bestsellers. Yes, that would be nice. But were you worried about that? Because it's not, it's
were
a
you-
much
were
more...
you- you
well,
ju-
I mean, it's not a book about that you might think, you know, about the domestic kind of... you know, like Gone Girl, and it was more of sort of a thriller kind
You mean,
of
was I
book.
worried about false advertising?
False advertising.
Yeah, you know,
is what I'm coming around
yeah,
to.
yeah.
yes,
No, I get that. Yeah, and I understand. And you know, it actually reminds me when I was a kid. When I was in college, and I read Dorothy Richardson's Pilgrimage. I don't know if you're familiar with
No.
it. The first stream of consciousness novel, 12 volumes about being a dental assistant.
Oh!
And they.
No, you're making that up.
No, and they had the first. It's a seminal modernist text, and they had been reprinted by I think Bantam or Crown, like a sort of mass
Yeah.
market publisher in the 70s in a 4-volume edition, where clearly they knew that it was not going to sell as a stream of consciousness novel about, you know, being an aspiring writer and dental assistant. It was not going to sell. So they had the 4 volumes had this blonde woman. Very sexy blonde woman in her hair in over the course of the 4 volumes in increasing disarray, and like in one of them her finger in her mouth, like you could imagine, like I had to put covers over it to carry it around to classes, but you know, clearly somebody thought, well, if we put a sexy cover on it, it's gonna sell.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean I have to be honest, I sort of in some mildly Asperger's-y way just didn't think about it.
Oh, that's very funny. In the book, one of the events in the book is that Cassie, so there's 2 friends. Cassie's this very slight, has white hair, a very striking, tiny girl, and Julia's the stronger of the 2. Well, stronger physically of the 2. But Cassie goes off in search of her father, and I won't give anything away. But I think I read somewhere that part of the book was. Based on something that had happened, you had friends in Australia who had.
Well, it wasn't strictly speaking so much it wasn't strictly speaking that's fiction. Like this is made up, right? But where that came from, that section of the book is it's the first person narrator, and Julia tells the story of what Cassie did, even though Julia wasn't there.
Right.
And that came from this experience that we lived in Australia till I was 9, and then we moved here, and as one did in those days, I kept in touch with my friends by writing letters, which I miss doing.
I know. It was great.
I miss receiving them too.
Yes.
But when we were all about 14 or 15, several of my friends wrote and were telling me sort of like the Gospels, fragments of a story of something that had happened to another friend of ours, which is not this story,
No.
and ended tragically. But that was all I ever had. So then I filled in, I took the different pieces and I was like, well, if you put them like this, maybe it makes sense like this. And then I had in my head the story of what I thought happened to this girl from my class. But I realized I would never really know, and that possibly the friends who wrote to me didn't really know, or what they knew would be partial because we were still kids and there were things really that the grown-ups didn't tell them. And then latterly, as I wrote a little thing, an article about this, and the magazine fact-checked it, so they had somebody go through like a couple years of the Sydney Morning Herald, now digitized, can you imagine, to find the incident, which then bore no resemblance whatsoever to the story that I'd carried around in my head. And my first thought was, wow, I must have misremembered everything. But there were certain things that I then checked that like I wouldn't have known if I hadn't been told in these letters. So then, then I realized there's an official story. That's the newspaper story, and that's not the true story either. Right, so there's that, for me, the thing that I sort of carried through my life and wanted to write about was not a set of facts,
right,
but a set of fictions.
Yes, yeah. What is the true story?
Yeah.
I'm very interested in you touched on this earlier. Julia says at one point, sometimes I felt that growing up and being a girl was about learning to be afraid. And this is sort of, the narrative of girls. Can you talk about that idea of fear and girls? And
well, I think it's something that I remember experiencing as a kid. The ages that these guys are in this book was when I was a kid in Toronto, and of course it was the 70s, and we all had a lot more. You could say, on the one hand, we had a lot more freedom. On the other hand, you could say our parents didn't give a hoot.
They were busy.
They were busy, right? Well, somebody was saying to me just the other day, like, what was it? People used to just rest, right? Like, moms would go into a darkened house. Like you'd go home and you'd go to a friend's house, and she'd say, "Don't make too much noise. My mom is resting."
That's right.
Right? Like the bedroom door was shut, the blinds were pulled. Yeah. Like, what was mom doing? Like, that was a thing.
Yeah, that was a thing.
That was a thing. We don't do that anymore much. Like, we're not allowed to do that anymore. But, or I don't feel like, anyway, I digress. But I remember, my mom was out. My mom, when we moved here, went to law school.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, and so and I got out earlier than my sister, and I would come home on the subway and then the bus, and then I would walk. And I would walk home to an empty house, and every day I was sure that somebody was going to pull up in a car and try to drag me into it. Really, I mean, I know that, like, maybe I was just insane. Obviously I was on some level insane, but I hadn't got that narrative from nowhere.
Yeah.
I got that from somewhere. And then you get bigger and you sort of forget about it. Although being wary or being careful just becomes something you internalize, and I think almost every woman has the experience of planning. If I go to that event, how will I get home?
Oh yeah.
Right. Or does that involve me walking 4 blocks at 11:30 at night? Are they blocks it's okay to walk? Is it well lit? Would I need to walk in the middle of the street? I mean, all of those things. And then as a parent, you see suddenly you're back there again, and you have a teenage daughter, and on the one hand you want her to have every freedom and to be strong and autonomous, and on the other she says, well, I can just walk home from I can walk home from the babysitting at 10, And
Yeah.
you say, no, no, that's
Yeah.
okay, I'll come get you.
Yeah, I have a daughter. She's 24 now, but even still, I still worry about her now. But it's such a fine line because you don't want them to be fearful.
Right.
You don't want them as women to be afraid of, to think that really they're not empowered. But on the other hand, you have to be realistic.
Right.
There are bad guys,
Yeah.
waiting in the night. And in the story, Cassie, the girl, is walking on the side of the highway, and a neighbor picks her up and pretty forcibly insists that she gets in the car because she's walking in the highway on the side of the night. And nothing awful happens at all. He simply brings her home. But Julia, the friend, in thinking about it afterwards, says that, there was almost like this frisson of, it was like almost like pornography, thinking about, what was the line here? A sort of made-up fear, like the feat in games of pretend or horror films, that when a teenage girl walks alone in the night, there is a story and it involves her punishment, which is the narrative
Right.
that
Well,
we have, right?
I do feel that obviously it's not a simple analogy, but say in the United States now, a great deal a great deal of effort has been put into making many people afraid of immigrants, just afraid of all immigrants,
yeah.
right? Well, statistically, you can actually look at the sort of numbers on that. There is no call to be afraid. Like the number of refugees who have committed crimes is something like 0.003. Like it's really minute.
Small.
And yet something is gained, right? The reason that people have said about making people afraid is because something is gained by doing that. And sometimes I wonder, well, what is gained? I mean, what would it be like if women weren't afraid, right? And what is gained by whom in making us afraid?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, on the immigrant thing, of course, you can't help think about the Trump dog whistle. It wasn't even a dog whistle, it was a shout from the rooftops,
Right.
About the other and how bad the other is, and, it was all about his kind of people. In contrast to that sort of, world out there of fear for girls, there's a lovely passage in your book where Julia remembers falling asleep as a child, and there was a lovely passage about, where you're half between falling asleep and awake, and, you can hear your parents, the buzz of their conversation, and there's some smells in the house. I mean, it really gave you a sense of home. I think we all remember
thank you.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember that from
I
being a kid?
do.
I remember it so well.
I do. And I remember, okay, no, this is just...
I digress, but go
I,
ahead.
no,
Yes.
I'm sure. No, I'm just me and neurosis. But I remember getting bigger, getting older, and wanting still to go to bed, but before my parents,
Mm-hmm.
even though because when I tried to go to sleep and the house was quiet, it freaked me out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted that. I found that the sounds of them moving around so reassuring.
It was very nice. There's a character in the book, and there was a line that struck me, speaking of girlhood and womanhood. This is not a major character. She runs an animal welfare hospital where the girls volunteer one summer, and her name is Marge, and Julia says about her, she gave us a different sense of how you could be in the world, someone who did what you did for the love of it and didn't care what anybody thought. And certainly that struck me as I think we all have met people like that who just in a moment of clarity, you look at them and you think, okay, this is something that could be my life, or I could do it. Did you is that something that you had?
Yes, I mean, I think there were various figures along the way, and we were speaking earlier, and you mentioned a teacher. I think teachers, there were the role of teachers, women teachers in my childhood was as people who seemed to have. I remember this was in Australia, my fourth grade teacher, who we thought she was absolutely fabulous, and she had trained or had done. She sang opera, so sometimes in front of the class she would burst into opera song, and I had kept my notebooks. She was clearly mad as a hatter, dear woman. This is fourth grade. I was like 9. There's one notebook that begins. Spinoza, a philosopher. Like she must have been a philosophy major in college, and she just thought, I'm going to teach these 9-year-olds some philosophy. But, you know, how fabulous. We thought she was the best ever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, there are, yeah, and we were talking in the green room before. You were saying too, there are people who they're singular. They just are who they are, and you know, you have to. It's such an admirable trait, you know, when you see that. And so, if they want to talk Spinoza to 9-year-olds, hey, you know, or sing it in an operatic way.
So cool,
perfectly
right?
Sensible. Perfectly sensible. There's also a line about mothers and daughters, and you're the mother of a daughter and a son. I have a daughter, but the daughter at one point, it's that stage in their life where they've reversed roles, and the daughter's comforting the mother and says, you know, don't worry, it's going to be okay. And I think most people have sensed that too. And I don't know if you know the writer Anne Marie MacDonald. She's written, of course, about abused children, but she talks about. She once told me that she thought that we had it the wrong way around. We thought that parents protected children, but actually children protected parents because they couldn't burden them with the knowledge. The children couldn't burden the parents with the knowledge of what the world was really like. Do you think that's true? It was such a compelling statement, I thought.
I think it's often, I mean, I think it's, I certainly, I mean, it's true in different ways at different ages.
Yeah.
But and in different situations. But I think kids see and feel and understand so much, and so much more than adults often give them credit for. And yes, I think I think we when we're kids, we often don't tell. You know, you do, and it is a thing of I suppose protecting your parents. I'm remembering an incident. There was a guy who this is Australia too. There was a guy who drove a bunch of us home from school in his station wagon, and none of us wanted to sit in. Some kids ended up in the front seat. You just didn't want to sit in the front seat because he had a wandering hand. You know, it was the 70s. The parents didn't notice, and so I figured out. That he liked it if I gave him a back massage. So I then could always sit right behind him, and he would pay me 2 cents a day. And my father came home from a business trip, and he said, "Oh, I'm so tired, and you know my neck really hurts." And I said, "Would you like a back massage?" And he said, "I beg your pardon." I was like 6. He said, "I beg your pardon." I said, "Well, I give Gary a back massage every day, and he pays me 2 cents." And you know, I didn't have the wit, obviously, to protect because then my mother had to drive us to and from school.
Oh yes, I bet. Oh my gosh. I wanted to talk a bit about unlikable women in fiction. In your book, The Woman Upstairs, your main character Nora was a very polarizing figure. You know, among readers, I remember discussing them at book club and that kind of thing, and also in the reviews. And I think you famously rapped the knuckles of a reviewer, I think, who asked you, "Would you want to be her friend, though?" Or wasn't it something along those lines?
She said everybody in the novel, but Nora particularly, they were all dislikable characters. And yeah, I said, what does that have to do with it?
Yes. So do you think that there's a feeling that women in fiction, and maybe even in life, have to be likable all the time?
I certainly think that women's anger is alarming to people, yeah, and to women themselves. And so I guess the short answer is yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was told when when I was still working on the book on The Woman Upstairs, I gave a reading. We were in Germany for the year, and I gave a reading, and at this institute where I was a fellow, and one of the other fellows, who was an older gentleman, came up, and he was Dutch, and he said, you know, when I was a kid, I never saw my mother angry, but on Saturday mornings, we would have breakfast, my brothers, my father, my mother, and then my mother would go up. We men folk would stay at the kitchen table, and our mother would go upstairs and clean the house. And while she cleaned the house, we could hear her swearing at the top of her lungs, just cursing and cursing and cursing. And then she would come downstairs smiling, and we would all pretend we hadn't heard, and we would just go on with the day. And you know, he never saw her raging. She was sort of hurling the broom around, you know.
Wow.
Yeah, and I feel like that's actually, we just, let's keep it out of sight.
Yeah, very therapeutic. You said, I think I saw in an interview, that you love ranters, but women, people who do rants, that is, but women aren't really, people don't want to see women ranting.
No, no. Well, I feel there are many things people don't want to see women doing.
Yes, let us
Yeah.
make a list.
Yeah.
There are
Yeah.
many.
Many things.
Yeah.
Many things. Yeah. I feel, I just feel that generally appetites are unseemly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anger, anger, greed, lust, a lot of things are not seemly.
I was saying to Claire in the green room that I'd gone to see Hillary Clinton on Thursday night at the CNE. So was anybody here? Anybody there? Here? Yeah, so it was a bit of a zoo, right? Big cavernous room, but it's such a love-in. But one of the things that you think about with Hillary is the nasty woman, the woman who couldn't seem to do anything right. So when you talk about somebody who nobody wanted, or a segment of society was appalled by almost everything she did. Did you ever understand this Hillary hatred, like what that was about?
Well, I think they have a word for that. But call it misogyny.
Yeah.
I do. The most qualified candidate
Yeah.
in the history of the United States. There's never been a more qualified candidate. And yet,
And yet.
who did
Yes.
the electorate
Yeah.
put in office?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It has that, are we there yet quality. One of the things she said, which I thought had the real ring of truth, was that people were fine with, for instance, when she was, this was the example that came up, when she was Secretary of State, you'll recall she was very well thought of, and people were always saying what a wonderful job she did. And so she said that when women were doing things in service of others, that was all fine. You could campaign for somebody, you could advocate for somebody, you could be on the side of the poor and the downtrodden. But when you said, hello over here, I'd like to now be the president, that was a completely different thing. It was the difference between doing something for people and doing something for yourself.
Well, something that's perceived to be for yourself, because
Yeah.
of course it's service to the max,
Yes.
right? But it's perceived to be, yes, for your own ends. Of course, now we have someone for whom it's manifestly, for
Yeah.
his own ends. So.
Yeah, it's, I was just down in New York a couple of weeks ago, and I walked by the Trump Tower, which is, now like a military base, really, because those poor people who live there in the same place, the street's completely closed off. But, it is astonishing to those of us, who live up here, that's the guy you went for.
I live in Massachusetts.
Yes, not the guy you went for. Yes, exactly. I want to talk about writing a bit. And Julia says in the book that although Cassie, the Cassandra character, you'd think might be the one who could see things, but Julia is the one who's able to see things. And she knows how stories unfold, and she thinks this is just kind of both a talent and a curse of hers, right? So talk about that a bit, about her idea that she can see things happening.
Well, I think back to the sort of the writerly mode, if you will, that one of the that it is, the Cassandra thing is Cassandra sees everything but nobody believes her.
Right.
Right. So it's not that helpful to see everything if you say you're about to right. There's not much benefit to the
Right.
to the foresight, and
Right.
and I think the degree to which it is the gift and the plight of the storyteller. Interestingly, I teach undergraduates and
At
I
Harvard,
just
right?
I just was giving them a Eudora Welty essay to read about place in fiction. It's a wonderful essay in the collection The Eye of the Story. They of course did not know who Eudora Welty was, but she wrote, as you may remember, that famous story. Of course, I'm not remembering the title, but which basically imagines the character who might be the murderer of Medgar Evers, and when 35 or 40 years after the event, they finally apprehended and tried the murderer of Medgar Evers he looked exactly like the character in her
Wow.
story. And you know, what she would say to you about that is or would have said, or perhaps even did say, is, you know, if you know a place very well and you know how people move in that place and how people are raised and educated and interact in that place, then when you make up a fictional story, if you observe precisely, it will essentially be true. It's the sort of Madame Bovary exists, you know, is down the road right now sort of thing. You know, that fiction is actually about it's like being a safecracker. You're sort of listening, you're trying to listen as carefully as you can to the specifics of how life is lived by particular people in a particular place at a particular moment.
I think you've also said that you don't write about incidents in your own life because they somehow become smaller when you put them on the page. What do you mean by that?
Well, you don't know what I mean by that?
No, call me crazy, Claire.
Well, if you think about how in any moment, right?
Yeah.
If somebody were trying to record from any individual person's perspective what it's like in this room right now, but all of it,
Yes.
right? It'd probably take you, 30 pages of text to get like everything, the light, the projector, the temperature, I'm not smelling anything, but maybe some vestigial smells of something, the texture of the carpet, the way the chairs feel, all of it, right? So when you write fiction, you have to choose 3 things, or like 2 things, or maybe you choose to just say nothing about the nature of the.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
But so you're containing it. Part of. I mean, it's like it's all a telegram, really. Right? You can't convey the whole thing, and yet again, back to the neurology of it. You know that when they do brain surgery, if they poke a little thing in your brain, it's all in there. The full-on memory of everything is in there, with every with the sound of the wind in the pines and the waves on the water and the rocking of the boat and the smell of the late August air and and the sound of the bird in the trees and the plane flying over. It's all there. Right. So we have it all, and when it's in us, we can sort of open that out and kind of be there. And then when you tell it, it's like putting it in a funnel, and what comes out is littler. You sort of nail it to the wall, and it's just smaller. And then it's like you've rewritten the memory, and you can't get the other one back.
Oh, well, that's not good.
Yeah.
So that's why you don't write about your life. Okay, because you don't want to do that. You have 3 passports, right?
I do, yeah.
So.
Well, yes, lapsed a little.
Okay.
But yeah.
So Canadian, American, and French, right? So when you think about yourself, how do you identify? Are you one of those, or all 3 of them, or? I had cause to say it earlier. I'm all of the above, right? I may be insufficiently one or the other for other people, but in myself, I'm all of the above. Right, I think it's not possible. Back to those, the memory things. The memories, the experiences that I have of being Canadian, which aren't just about the years that we lived here, but about the fact that when we lived in Australia, where we knew ourselves to be expatriates. What we came home to was my grandmother's house on Grenadier Heights, and my grandparents' house in France. That was home, right? So those were the places that we returned to, and that I understood myself to belong. So, and then after we left here, my sister came right back for university and graduate school, and her life was here, and my grandmother was here, and my parents had a house in Napanee, and these. There are all these things that are mine that aren't from outside and aren't sort of notional. They're actually the tables and chairs and pizzas and, chocolate brownies of my life, right? So for me, it's a very tangible reality.
if you sort of, again, you funnel it down and you say it, and people are like, oh, you spent a few years here. I got it.
Yeah, yeah, no, you're right. The sentence doesn't do the experience justice. It does not. I want to ask you just a quick question. We're going to be going to audience questions in a minute. So I mentioned in the introduction that you're married to the literary critic for the New Yorker, James Woods. So do you have like a DMZ in your house when he's reviewing a book, or does he ask your opinion, or like, how does that?
Well, no. I mean,
she said suspiciously, yes. No, I just meant, does he talk to you about it, or is he very solitary about writing the whatever book?
Well, mostly, I mean, it actually very occasionally happens that we're reviewing the same books.
Ah.
That very occasionally happens. But mostly, he's reviewing things I haven't read. And so, he might venture something over the dinner table about what he's thinking about it. But I'm capable of a little more than, right? I mean, because I haven't read it, so I don't have an opinion. Or might ask a question,
Yeah,
So it isn't, it isn't, and he isn't somebody he doesn't sort of dash off a draft and hand it to me and say, what do you think? No, he does not do that. So sometimes often at this point, I read things in print for the first time.
Oh, so you don't see it at all? You just.
I mean, I
read
see
in the
it
New
just
York-
when you do, say, as it were. Yeah.
And the last question was, you mentioned teaching creative writing at Harvard. I'm interested in what that group of, so they're born, like, they're really young, right? They were born like in the late 1990s or even the 2000s. What are their concerns? Like, what do you find that they want to write about?
It's so diverse. It really is so diverse. Not least because with the classes, it's not a concentration, or it's just and anybody can take the classes. So I might have somebody in the graduate school of education, somebody in the law school, a physics major, an environmental sciences major, all different people from all over the university, different ages, different interests, and they're all together in one classroom, and the work that people produce runs the gamut, and so I mean, I can't sort of simply say they're interested in this or that, but I do feel as though that they have a much more fluid sense of what's real, right? Then they're much readier to sort of slip into fantasy. I think the combination of everybody read the sort of was imprinted on Harry Potter, right? That's where everybody started, and you add that to the sort of internet, right, where so many things are possible, and they are less bound by what's real.
And do you find that they're big readers? I mean, you would think at a university like Harvard, you'd have, the cream of the crop, that they are big readers, are they? Because
many of them, I mean, some of them are, it really varies.
Yeah.
There are many people who want to write and don't really read, and then you think, well, who do you think is going to read you if you don't read anybody else? I mean, but it's a weird thing. But many of them, I mean, there are many sort of fascinating, really interesting young people, and they read a whole range of things. I do find that many of them are quite. We having a conversation about this earlier today. I think people are so much more in the world because of social media that they're very aware of what books are new and what writers are up and coming, and so they read. They're often very contemporary readers, and you find that even writers that we think of who are living, that we think of as absolutely canonical, are they're very vague. I mean, I had a class last spring where half of them weren't really clear who Toni Morrison was.
Really?
Yeah. So and yet, they've read, books off the Booker shortlist or the National Book Award. I mean, it's just a weird thing.
That is really interesting. Toni Morrison, I mean, man,
I know.
that's.
I know. So then what? Like, if not that, then what?
Yeah. Okay. All right.